Moments after the US delegation walked out of the Kremlin, everything changed. A high-level meeting between the United States and Ukraine, scheduled for weeks and prepared down to the last detail, was suddenly canceled on the spot. No delay, no reschedule, no explanation, just a blunt message delivered within seconds. The meeting will not take place. In Kiev, President Volodymyr Zelensky was reportedly stunned, left without answers at a moment when Ukraine needed clarity more than ever. And in Brussels, where European officials had already gathered for what they believed would be a crucial three-way dialogue, a shockwave spread across the room as news broke that Washington was not coming. What happened? Why did the cancellation occur immediately after the US delegation left the Kremlin? And what was said behind those closed doors that forced Washington to change course within minutes? Inside the Brussels meeting hall, the lights remained on, documents neatly arranged, translators waiting, security tightened. Everything was ready, except the Americans. As minutes turned into hours, it became clear this wasn't a delay, it was a message. Meanwhile, Washington's silence was deafening. No statement, no clarification, no reassurance for Ukraine or NATO. And when observers noticed the US plane flying directly back to Washington, bypassing Brussels altogether, one question dominated every analysis on the continent. What did the US hear or agree to in Moscow? In geopolitics, sudden moves are never random. They signal shifts, pressure, warnings, or new deals forming beneath the surface. And this cancellation, happening within mere minutes, may mark one of the most significant and alarming turning points in months. The unanswered question remained. What changed? Analysts across Europe rushed to piece together what might have triggered such an abrupt reversal from Washington. The timing was too precise and too coordinated to be a simple logistical issue. According to multiple diplomatic sources, the cancellation came less than 10 minutes after the US delegation's motorcade left the Kremlin gates. That detail alone set off alarms. Initial reports suggest the discussions inside the Kremlin were far more intense and consequential than expected. The length of the meeting, the absence of any public briefing, and the stern expressions on US officials' faces all hinted at a private negotiation that may have included a direct warning, a strategic demand, or classified intelligence strong enough to force Washington to rethink its next steps. In Kiev, the mood shifted from confusion to anxiety. Zelensky's team understood the symbolism. When the United States skips a meeting with Ukraine right after speaking with Russia, the message, intentional or not, is unmistakable. It signals uncertainty. It signals recalculation, and it suggests that something significant was discussed in Moscow that Ukraine was not part of. European diplomats described the moment as one of the most unsettling signals in months, fearing this could indicate early stages of a strategic shift, possibly involving pressure on Ukraine to soften its stance in future negotiations. Washington's silence was speaking louder than words. Observers near the Kremlin noticed something striking. The American officials exited with no press briefing, no remarks, no eye contact with reporters, unusually tight expressions, and a hurried pace. It looked less like the conclusion of a planned meeting and more like the aftermath of an unexpected confrontation. Minutes later, the motorcade, and as soon as the US plane lifted off from Moscow, the Brussels meeting disappeared from Washington's schedule. Flight trackers later showed that the US jet had altered its route mid-air, skipping Brussels entirely and returning directly to Washington, D.C. That visible rerouting triggered a wave of speculation across diplomatic circles. Did the Kremlin deliver a warning, a proposal, or a red line Washington felt it could not cross? Whatever happened inside that closed room triggered an immediate operational shift, serious enough to override weeks of planning with Ukraine. With Washington silent and Moscow offering no clues, analysts proposed several theories. Some believed the Kremlin delivered a critical warning, military, nuclear, or geopolitical, that forced Washington to pause secondary meetings. Others suspected the United States was pressuring Ukraine to adjust its strategy, Another theory suggested the US was avoiding escalation with Moscow by canceling a highly visible pro-Ukraine engagement. The most controversial idea was that Washington and Moscow might be exploring some early-stage framework to stabilize the region, one Ukraine was not yet included in. And finally, some believed the US delegation received classified intelligence in Moscow that instantly changed the risk landscape, requiring urgent consultations in Washington. For Ukraine, the cancellation was more than a diplomatic embarrassment. It was a strategic shockwave. Inside Kiev, officials described a cold silence spreading through the room as the news arrived. Zelensky, who had placed enormous hope in the Brussels meeting, was reportedly stunned. The timing made everything worse. A cancellation immediately following US-Russia talks suggested that Washington was recalculating. Within hours, advisors scrambled for clarity. Emergency briefings were held, intelligence channels activated, diplomatic missions contacted, but no clarity came. European partners were equally confused. Ukrainian media filled with speculation and fear. Citizens already exhausted by war wondered whether a shift in US policy could mean fewer weapons, fewer commitments, and fewer guarantees. Behind closed doors, Kiev confronted a difficult reality. If the United States is recalibrating its strategy, Ukraine could lose the strongest pillar of its defense. This uncertainty affects everything: military planning, diplomatic moves, and public morale. The abrupt cancellation of the meeting was more than a disruption, it was a signal. One strong enough to override weeks of preparation and send shockwaves through Europe's political core. The most unsettling part was that no one was explaining why. Washington remained silent. Ukraine received no clarity. The real conversation is happening somewhere else behind doors the public will never see. Whether this moment marks a temporary adjustment or the beginning of a much larger strategic shift remains unknown. But one reality is impossible to ignore. The stakes have changed. The balance of power is shifting, and every nation involved can feel it. The question now is simple yet deeply unsettling.